Hello for everyone joining us around the world. Welcome to the seminar on NATO's Deterrence and Defense Agenda. My name is Terry Martin. I'm a senior news anchor at Deutsche Welle Television, also known as DW News. And it's my privilege and honor to lead this discussion with Patrick Turner, who will be joining us in just a moment. Patrick Turner, of course, is the NATO Assistant Secretary General for Defense and Policy Planning. I should mention at this point, there we go. Great to see you. I should mention that this event is being organized by GlobeSec, the global think tank, and NATO's Public Diplomacy Division under the NATO Engages banner. For those of you who weren't in London for the NATO meeting last year, GlobeSec was a consortium member of the Innovating the Alliance event. They are also under the NATO Engages banner. Well, as you all know, Patrick Turner is the Assistant Secretary General for Defense Policy and Planning at NATO. He's been in that position since 2018. Prior to that, he was the UK Deputy Permanent Representative to the North Atlantic Council, a position he held from 2011 to 2015. But his association with NATO goes back much further than that. He has worked for multiple Secretaries General, and his work in defense planning goes all the way back to at least the 80s. In 1984, I understand he joined the UK Ministry of Defense. Now, just before I hand the floor over to Mr. Turner for presentation, I just want to remind everyone who's with us to please send us your questions using the moderation app or the Q&A app on Zoom. We'll go through as many of those questions as we can during the second half of this hour. Now, we're here to talk about NATO's deterrence and defense agenda, where it is right now, and above all, where it's headed, with NATO having grown to include 30 members. We want to talk about how the pandemic is affecting the agenda. We want to talk about current and potential threats, and how Mr. Turner sees NATO's capacity to counter those. Got some annoying beeps coming through my computer. I hope they're not going all everywhere. Anyway, Mr. Turner, it's a great privilege and honor for me to be leading this conversation with you today, and I turn the floor over to Mr. Patrick Turner.
Thank you very much, Terry. Hello to everybody joining. I really look forward to a debate, so I'll try and keep my opening remarks short. And Terry, thanks for the depressing reminder of how long ago it was that I started in defense and security. But so I will be brief. I'm not going to skip COVID at all, but I also want to talk about our current pre-existing deterrence and defense agenda, the need for which has not gone away. So, but first of all, a massive thank you from here in NATO to health professionals across the alliance, in our member countries, in our partner countries, to our armed forces who've been helping out in a huge variety of ways in dealing with the pandemic crisis. So NATO's core job, you know it well, is to ensure peace and stability for the billion citizens who are in NATO countries, the 30 NATO countries, as you said, and we're continuing to do that. So that's almost the main simple message I want to give. Just last month, both NATO foreign ministers and NATO defense ministers met virtually by VTC. So we've shown ourselves we can do that. It works well, and in both events gave a strong message, both of resilience and unity. So we have, at the moment, to simplify a little bit, we have three particular priorities. One, our role, the role of allies, the role of armed forces in allied countries, the role of NATO in the COVID-19 response. That is a high priority. And for us, that is both about making sure that we can continue to deliver on operations, missions, activities, training, exercising, and ensure that our posture is not undermined by COVID-19, but it's also very much about helping civil authorities, and I will get on to that. But we've had, there have been tens of thousands of people from armed forces across the alliance helping out with the response. Second, maintaining our operations, our readiness, and our vigilance, because, as I say, our role is to ensure peace and stability. So making sure that none of those things are undermined, and if anything, as I'll come to, building our readiness. And third, we have been adapting our deterrence and defense posture, that's what we call it, since 2014, both in the light of what Russia did in Ukraine in 2014, Crimea and eastern Ukraine, and in the light of the rise of ISIS. On the first, the pandemic response, we have been doing lots of things amongst allies, between allies and partners. About a month ago, General Walters was put in charge of the coordination of activities. So that means using air capabilities to move equipment in and out of the alliance, within the alliance. So we've had over 100 flight missions, constructed 25 field hospitals, 25,000 beds, as I said, tens of thousands of troops in a number of allied countries. This is the biggest peacetime military operation there has ever been. Thousands of military medics, and there are countless examples of precise examples of helping out between allies, equipment and personal protective equipment, ventilators and so on, being transported around. One point I would very strongly make is that I think this illustrates super clearly for us, for our publics, one of the values of having armed forces. They have made a huge contribution as part of the overall response in support of civil authorities in allies. So part of this is a demonstration of the point of defense investment. And I would use the word insurance. So one of the lessons already being drawn from the crisis, and that I'm sure will be drawn, is that preparedness, being ready in terms of plans, in terms of stockpiles, in terms of capabilities, ability to adapt and respond quickly, is a key lesson. And you could say that's about preparedness or insurance. Similarly, defense spending, and we've been working hard to increase that, is about, in a sense, about paying for an insurance policy. So one is a health insurance policy, the other is a security insurance policy. And in this crisis, the two are connected. I'm sure we might come back to that. Then, maintaining our readiness and our vigilance, we've been messaging clearly, the Secretary General has been messaging clearly in recent weeks that the threats and challenges that we face have not gone away. The crisis may modify how they manifest themselves. There may be additions, different angles to the challenges, but the basic challenges that we face have not gone away. So whether that's terrorism, or Russia, or other threats and challenges, cyber and so on. So there is no less reason because of the crisis to remain ready, to remain vigilant, to remain prepared. So the third theme is we will keep going with the adaptation of our deterrence and defense posture. On our operations and activities, we remain in Afghanistan. There have been some modest impact on the mission there. Some of the personnel that is being managed, the mission has not been undermined. We're still in Kosovo. We're still maintaining maritime operations. We're still maintaining the forward presence battalions that we agreed to put into the Baltic states and Poland. Just at the moment, there is an exercise underway in Estonia between the forward presence battalion, American forces, Estonian home defense forces, and just in the last few days, France, Spain, and the UK have deployed what we call Baltic air policing aircraft to the Baltic states as part of an ongoing mission there. We're maintaining in London, which you referenced, we confirmed that we had gathered all the contributions to what we call the 430s readiness initiative, the NATO readiness initiative. So that means 30 medium or heavy battalions, 30 combat ships, 30 kinetic air squadrons. We gathered all of those contributions, and now we're building the capability of those forces, and those forces are designed to be employable within 30 days, and that is in what we call a 360-degree approach. So that is wherever they may be needed, but especially for collective defense. We're working on readiness. We're working on reinforcement. We have had to, people will have seen that we've had to scale down some of our exercises and training. The largest exercise for the first part of the year was an American-led exercise involving a lot of allies called Defender 2020. So the scale of that was reduced in the light of COVID, but that still involved bringing 6,000 American troops across the Atlantic and bringing a lot of equipment, vehicles, both across the Atlantic and out of storage in Europe. So we were still able to do that. We're working hard on improving our military mobility, the speed with which we can move in Europe and get across borders. There was a good Atlantic Council paper and debate on that a couple of weeks ago. We are continuing to respond to the challenge posed by a set of Russian missiles and novel capabilities. We have been looking at the consequences of Russia's violation and the subsequent collapse as a result of that of the INF treaty, which was the result of a Russian treaty violating missile system. But there are a number of threatening Russian missile systems. So we've taken some measures in a range of areas, conventional capability, air and missile defense, our nuclear posture, arms control, training and exercises in response to that threat. We are continuing to look at what further we may need to do. And then last, I'd say on the current agenda, there's plenty of other things on the agenda, but I'd quite like to get into the debate phase, if you like. Last, we are doing work on our civilian preparedness or resilience, and one example of that in the COVID context is having another look at what we call our resilience baseline. So baselines we set to all of the members of the alliance to ensure continuity of government, continuity of services to the public, ability to support armed forces. So in areas like telecommunications, energy, transport, ability to deal with large numbers of casualties, ability to deal with population movement, food and water, and so on. And we're doing an urgent exercise to update those in the light of the COVID crisis. That's probably enough as a start.
So let me get back with you here. My video to join in. There we are. Great. That was very helpful, very enlightening. Thank you so much, Mr. Turner, for that review of where things stand now. Oh, let me see. Are you with me? So I think I'm back with you. Very good. Thank you. Yeah, I can imagine that meeting you had 3 weeks ago on April 15th with the defense ministers. That was your first virtual meeting that you've had through secure video link. Before we get into the nitty gritty of the defense security posture, just wanted to ask you about how that meeting was, meeting virtually. Did that all work well? Were you able to exchange the views the way you were hoping to?
So, in fact, last month we had a virtual meeting of foreign ministers at the beginning of the month, and then a virtual meeting of defense ministers 2 weeks later. Both of them worked exceptionally well. So, hats off to technicians. We're able to have secure links with capitals where you can have a private and classified conversation. So that was a good test. We assumed that it would be able to do it, but it worked exceptionally well. The one thing you obviously don't achieve in virtual meetings is, normally during NATO ministerials, this well, there's plenty of, if you like, bilateral action meetings behind the scenes. You can't do all the meetings behind the scenes on a screen, so you have to find another way of doing that.
Great. I just want to say to people who are following us that we are getting some responses already. Some questions are coming in for Mr. Turner, which we'll be looking at towards the second half of this hour. So please do keep your questions coming. Mr. Turner, I want to ask you about the statement that was delivered following the meeting on April 15th with the defense ministers when Jens Stoltenberg made a statement. He said that potential adversaries will look to exploit this situation with COVID-19. He said that terrorist groups could be emboldened. He referred to the fragility of the security situation in Afghanistan and Iraq and mentioned, quote, the continued pace of Russian military activity. You've talked about that to some degree. He highlighted disinformation from state and non-state actors trying to sow division in the alliance. I want to tease out a little more on the question of unity and trying to undermine our democracies. Could you elaborate on some of that, please?
That's a very short menu. Thank you very, very much.
It gives you a lot to choose from.
Thank you. So as I said, the main challenges we faced have not gone away. The sort of challenges that were addressed by NATO leaders in London have not gone away. They may morph, but I'm not sure that this is going to necessarily transform the challenges. If either states or non-state actors perceive a chance to, if they perceive division both amongst allies, amongst the political West, if you like, within individual member countries of the alliance, then they will try to exacerbate those divisions, sometimes with disinformation, sometimes with accusations which are simply untrue. An example of a particularly egregious piece of disinformation was a purported letter by the NATO Secretary General saying that NATO planned to withdraw its forward presence battalion from Lithuania. So absolutely untrue. So when you look back on that kind of thing, it's absurd. But for a few moments, hours, whatever it is, a false impression is created. And terrorist groups, we don't know how they will exploit this crisis, but you can imagine that in a situation where people's health, welfare, prosperity is being affected in various regions, there may be more opportunities for them to exploit. But as I say, the full range of things that we were thinking about, I'd add China to the list of things we were thinking about, have not gone away.
I'm glad you mentioned China. That's an important point. Before we talk about China, though I do want to stick with Russia because that is, you've already referred to the disinformation that is coming from there. Have you also observed increased activity from Russia in terms of antagonizing NATO member states during this pandemic, aside from disinformation?
I wouldn't start ascribing, if you like, a percentage or putting it on a chart. I think people who want to sow disinformation or try and exploit the possibility of division or uncertainty will take their chances when the chances appear. But for a number of years, we've been in a circumstance where state actors, it's not just one state actor, and non-state actors have sought to undermine us below the threshold which would trigger some kind of military response. So hybrid action, grey zone action, whatever term you want to use for it. And that continues, but do we have a yardstick which tells us it's suddenly 20% up? If so, I don't know that.
Okay, so we're not going to look at that dial moving in either direction in this conversation, at least. Sticking with COVID for a second, and Russia, and other countries for that matter, in fighting the pandemic, which doesn't discriminate when it comes to its enemies, could one not say that, say, Russia and NATO are fighting a common enemy here that might actually give them an opportunity to cooperate and discuss overcoming some of their differences?
So that's a perfectly fair question, which would be a normal question to answer. This is a global challenge requiring global action and responses affecting pretty well every country around the globe. It would be a logical moment to move towards more cooperation, less tension, but we have not really seen much evidence of that. I would say I'm not sitting here to say things are markedly worse than they were a few months ago, but there are no especial signs that they're markedly better either, and we're still in a competitive, at least, environment, and we're still in an environment where we face real threats. If you were in Ukraine or Georgia, for example, at the moment, you wouldn't necessarily be feeling that things have got markedly better over recent weeks.
You mentioned China just once, but you did mention it, and it's not a primary, when we're talking about the defense posture of NATO, we don't hear too much about China, at least in my business as a news journalist. It's very much focused, at least in Europe, on the potential threat coming from Russia and concerns about what's happening on NATO's eastern flank, what's going on in the Baltic region, etc. But what about China? China is within this COVID-19 crisis also using the situation to its own advantage as much as it can. It's cooperating with the world to a large degree, but it's also pursuing its own agenda. Where do you see China in terms of the security and deterrence agenda, the defense and deterrence agenda for NATO at this point?
So our
where is it on
deterrence
your radar? Yeah.
our deterrence and defense agenda was set principally in response to what Russia did in Ukraine in 2014, and actions it has continued to take since the deterrence and defence agenda is not constructed with China specifically in mind, but we have started to think, what are the implications of some of the things that China has been doing? We say that China, if you like, has come to us rather than us planning to go to China. So significant Chinese investments in strategic infrastructure, questions about 5G, Chinese investments in strategic materials, interest in, if you like, exerting influence. So Belt and Road, or the Silk Road, whatever you call it, has gone a very long way in a lot of directions, and has had an impact in many countries, debt diplomacy, and so on. So we are, China has a stake in the majority of the top 50 container terminals in the world, for example. So we have to think, does that have an impact on our ability to operate, to defend ourselves ultimately, or to project, if we were doing crisis management operations, projecting stability. So we are in a mode of just being better aware of what the Chinese posture and intent is, including military activity, and thinking about the implications, but not at all saying China is a clear and present danger in Europe. I can't hear.
My apologies. Just trying to find that click on the right unmute button. Just one question, final question from me before we go over to questions from the participants, because we're getting some really interesting ones coming in now. The final question is this: in light of what we're seeing happening from COVID-19, how it is debilitating the world, and compromising to some degree the readiness, and I say to some degree, perhaps only marginally, but there are NATO troops who are getting sick as well. We can't deny that. And if it did stop Defender Europe 20 from going ahead, that was scheduled to take place, even though some troops and equipment were moved. Does this make NATO think harder about the potential of bio-warfare?
So great question. I think the answer to that must be yes. I think I said earlier on that some of Defender had gone ahead, so it was not simply cancelled. Significant number of US troops still moved to Europe, and a lot of equipment moved. So all of that was not lost, and the intent is to continue holding those exercises regularly into and in Europe. I think I also said, even today, there is an exercise underway in Estonia with several thousand troops, both NATO troops and Estonian troops. So we've not simply said to ourselves it's impossible to exercise or to train. Our assessment continues to be that the overall impact on our readiness, our operations, is modest and limited. But it is clear that if a malign actor wanted deliberately to use a bio device, you could have a very major impact. So we will indeed have to think about the possibility of, we do already think about it, but there's even more of an incentive to do it now.
There we go. So what you're saying was fits very well into what you were mentioning at the beginning in terms of adapting the deterrence and defense posture of NATO. in light of what happened at that time in 2014 with Russia and Crimea and Eastern Ukraine followed. But there are other threats out there, and I'm sure we're going to be hearing more about that. So I want to turn the floor over now to bring in some of the input from other participants who are joining us today. And I'm going to pick up, first of all, on on a question from Anna Wieslander. She's asking, in the beginning, I unfortunately don't have the details to tell you exactly who everyone is going to be. So I'm just going to give a name. I'm not going to attempt to try to decipher who these people are associated with or where they're coming from, because I don't have that information in front of me, even though I know some of them. Anna Wieslander, she's saying, you may perhaps know her. In the beginning, there were a lot of competition among allies to get a hold of protective equipment, such as masks, disinfection, etc., in the pandemic. She's asking, are there lessons learned for NATO's procurement process? For instance, could it be better used so that it promotes the common good and facilitates solidarity in situations of scarcity? This, again, is basically talking about the common enemy question that we all face.
So great question. Indeed, there was, we've experienced some competition for scarce resources. So that raises at least two questions. One is, why is it that the resources have been so scarce, or why are we over-reliant on a small number of suppliers? So that needs addressing. And then could we do better at coordinating production procurement? And I'm sure the answer to that is yes, that we could. Could we do better at coordinating the stockpiling of equipment? So the EU, I know, is doing some work in this area. Allies will also want to do that. So this will both be an incentive for more allies to be able to engage in self-help, but also an incentive to look at whether we can get better at helping each other. And a lot of the work that we are doing now is not for some distant future where there's a crisis on a similar scale or posing similar challenges, but also against the possibility of a second wave in the autumn. So NATO wants to do, it's not a healthcare provider, but it wants to do its part in overall international efforts involving lots of organizations to get as well prepared as we can be for another wave if there is one.
There was some criticism of NATO for perhaps not providing more support to civilian populations. You mentioned some of the things that were done, yet of course we live in an environment where you can be sure there's going to be criticism coming from some direction. But I'm just wondering what you would say to the critics who are. My question would be first in the form: is this a business that NATO should be involved in, is supporting the civilian populations for the billion people, as you pointed out earlier, who are now living in the NATO area?
So it's not, it's not NATO's primary mission. Our primary mission is to defend alliance territory, defend alliance populations, ensure peace and security. But if we face a crisis on the enormous scale of COVID, it would be very strange indeed if every organization, every country, every resource did not look at how you make a contribution. And as I said, across the alliance, I've not done the maths, but you're probably into hundreds of thousands of armed forces helping in a whole variety of ways in the crisis. So you don't necessarily invest in armed forces principally for that reason. But if you've spent the money to invest in armed forces, then when you hit a crisis like this, they provide huge capability, logistic capability, medical capability, planning capability, expertise in disinfection, transport capacity, all kinds of things that they do for you. I think I'd push back against the the notion that the response was slow or inadequate. You can always say it would be possible to do more and faster, but I think there are a plethora of examples where allies have helped each other, more or less hundreds of examples. And we've been saying that certainly in this current phase of the crisis, different allies have been affected at different times in different areas, different speeds. So allies have been pretty active. Allies who are less affected at a particular time have been pretty active in saying we will help. Allies who have spare capacity have been very generous in sharing that spare capacity when the temptation might have been, I'm just going to keep all of this for me.
Fine. A couple of questions concerning the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on the economy and how that affects countries, NATO member states, their ability to contribute financially, particularly meeting the 2% target. I'll use some of the language that one user here, Simon Arswari, I think it is. The question is, he's saying, are allies discussing how the impact will affect the defense budgets and burden sharing, especially if there are going to be defense budgets cut? Also, how is that going to affect readiness and within the alliance, and how is it going to affect deterrence? Is there a process in place to mitigate negative effects?
So it's very clear that there will this year be an effect on GDP, across the alliance in each individual country. New figures come out more or less by the day, new projections. It's not clear, however, how long this impact is going to be, because we don't know how long the crisis is going to last or the magnitude. So personally, I would be hesitant, and I think the alliance collectively would be hesitant to start drawing premature conclusions. I frankly extend that thought to a whole lot of different areas, but certainly in the area of defense expenditure, you can certainly see now that individual allies and other countries will have to look hard at their budgets, that there will be an even more special priority given to health preparedness and so on. These are, were priorities already, but I go back to saying the crisis illustrates that insurance matters. So health insurance provision in advance of capabilities, stockpiles, ability to be resilient and to respond matter, and security insurance matters. And if part of what that security insurance buys you is hundreds of thousands of usable armed forces who can support civil authorities in lots of ways, the two go together. But it will be a question. It's not a question we're trying to answer right now, because it's really too early to get into the detail of it.
Pop-up says unmute myself. I'm compliments to Zoom on that. And thank you for pointing out. I work as a broadcaster, and fortunately where I work we have technicians who normally take care of all that for me, so hat off to them as well. So anyway, we're getting lots of questions about COVID-19, and so I'm going to stick with this for just a little bit more, and I'm seeing some other questions as well. We still have some time to get to those. But on the question of COVID-19, there are questions concerning possible readjustment within NATO in terms of how it sets its priorities for deterrence and defense, that perhaps this would be an opportunity to focus more on invigorating the adoption of cyber intelligence operations and using artificial intelligence, putting more into the technologies that may not be quite as expensive as some of the battlefield hardware.
So some of the what you're talking about we've been doing anyway. So we have a big strand of work on looking at emerging and disruptive technologies. We have for several years been doing a lot of work in the cyber area, cyber defense, cyber as a domain, and indeed it is always the case that you should try to get the most out of defense budget. So whatever their level, you should be getting the most out of them. As it happens, we've been rebuilding defense budgets for the last 5 years. We will certainly try to preserve and maintain that rebuilding, but I would say this crisis underlines the need to get as much as you can, and if there are ways of achieving the same effect or a better effect at lower cost, then you're always going to go for that. But I do not think we're about to enter an environment where, if you like, new domains of operations or new ways in which you have to defend yourself, such as in cyberspace, suddenly mean that longer standing means such as the battalions, the ships and the aircraft that I was talking about have gone out of business. They have not. And COVID is has not, so far as I can see, yet, if you like, reshaped our domains of operation. So it may, as we were discussing earlier, have an impact. We may have to think even harder about ability to be resilient against continue functioning in the context of a some kind of biological attack. But the world hasn't changed overnight in a military sense.
The world hasn't changed overnight. That's for sure. Much has changed, though, and we're seeing some problems exacerbated through the crisis. The tensions between the U.S. and China have not diminished during this crisis. Indeed, one of our participants points out that this is being irritated even further. And so, if just paraphrasing what's said there, do you see this putting NATO in a position where it's going to be obliged to give greater priority to China as a potential threat?
As I said, we had already been thinking to ourselves that we needed to assess the impact of some of the activities of China in a range of areas. That work, that thinking will continue in any event. I would have thought that, as we were discussing earlier, one of the takeaways from the crisis is it's both in, if you like, in the health domain, but also in other domains. Last year we spent a lot of work thinking about the resilience of telecommunications in a 5G world when there was a rather limited number of suppliers. More thought will be given to over dependence on this or that supplier, and in this case, in both of those, some of the healthcare equipment, and in 5G, the situation is over dependence. But I would hesitate to say again that the fundamentals of the global security situation have just suddenly changed, that this year is markedly different than last year in terms of the challenges that we face. There may be new angles, there may be more focus, but have the fundamentals changed? No.
So some are already asking about what sort of lessons we can learn from this crisis that might be of value to NATO in different ways. One of those ways is how the Defense Alliance can communicate its role better to the world, and also in terms of deterrence, to make it clear to any potential adversaries what NATO's capabilities are for dealing with crises of all kinds.
So great question. If collectively allies invest around $1 trillion a year in defense, if collectively we have reinvested heavily in defense, a figure that we used at the London meeting of NATO leaders last December was a prospective extra 400 billion and already 130 billion, then a lot of what you're buying with all of that investment, both the underlying budgets and the increases, is a lot of capability, both capability in terms of people, so those people have been deployed in this crisis, but capability, and it is a large investment. So thinking intelligently about how you communicate that capability, you demonstrate that capability in exercises, in activities, not in a provocative way, but just to be clear that the capability exists and that we have the will and the ability to defend ourselves. That will be all the more important. I would be, however, now is a time for international actors to be careful about the communicating they do, because there are more pressures, there are tensions, there are economic and financial impacts right now which are pretty severe. So you want to be all the more careful about messaging and understanding each other well, communicating well with each other.
That question, by the way, came through a couple of sources, but I was paraphrasing, phrasing, putting things together largely from a guy named Paul Cornish. And we have something from Radovan Javorcek, if I'm pronouncing that name correctly. I'm going to read it out because it's very, very well articulated. It says, NATO is a political military alliance. However, it has a strong reach to civilian non-military sector, namely civil emergency. He's asking, do we have 7 base... It's just moving away. He's saying we do have 7 baseline requirements for civil emergency planning. This keeps jumping. Sorry, it's just disappeared off my screen. 7 baseline requirements for, where did it go? It's gone again. My apologies. For civil emergency planning, it says after COVID-19, it is clear that civil emergency will have to get more prominent place in NATO and inside nations. Moreover, many in Europe see the EU as a driver in civil emergency. From a defense planning position, do we need to better embed civil emergency and resilience of critical infrastructure into defense planning? Where do you see the role of NATO-EU cooperation on this?
Great. So the last question was from an old colleague of mine from academic days in London, and this question is from a colleague of mine here, one of the NATO ambassadors. So thank you for both questions. Very good question. I talked about our baseline requirements. So indeed, there are 7. I think one of the takeaways from this crisis is that resilience, preparedness, really matters. And NATO decided to underline the importance of resilience and preparedness 4 years ago at a summit in Warsaw. Leaders made a commitment on it. Resilience and preparedness, national preparedness, they are national responsibilities. So in the end, the tools lie in the hands of nations. The choices about how prepared and how good whole of government, whole of society approach to resilience individual nations take is a choice in the hands of nations. But NATO cares about this because our ability to defend the billion people in the end relies on the resilience of each of the members of the alliance. And the North Atlantic Treaty says before you get to Article 4, consultation in a crisis, Article 5, mutual self-defense clause, you have an article which says individual members of the alliance are obliged to be able to be resilient. So I think both the content of the requirements that we place on nations may now need to adapt, and the seriousness with which we take those requirements when we set targets on nations will need to adapt. But I come back to saying, in the end, these are choices in the hands of individual allies, but our collective level of preparedness always mattered a lot, has certainly mattered over the last few years for a variety of reasons, and matters very much indeed now.
A question from Nikki Johnson on a current issue. Nikki, I presume, is a woman, I don't know. Anyway, she, I will say, it says it's noteworthy anyway, that Nikki says it's noteworthy that the US and UK did their first pass through the Barents Sea in support of Arctic security since the 1980s, just a few days ago. I'm sure you're aware of that. That's been in the news. Get Nikki back here. Her question is, or his, what is NATO's role in Arctic security? And what do you think NATO or NATO allies' key capability gaps are in that domain? A lot of focus up there with the ice melting.
So I would say, one, all of us will have more of an interest if you look to the coming years and decades in the Arctic with the ice melting, and it presents opportunities and perhaps challenges. I know that the countries around the Arctic who have the most direct stake in the Arctic have worked hard to make sure that it's not become an area of confrontation. I very much hope we can stick to that approach, but we're going to need to become more interested in ensuring that we maintain, if you like, mutual security in that region, and that the level of tension, threat does not go up. So it will need, in the coming years, need more attention, and I hope that we give that to it. But I'm not going to get into capability gaps and how tension might manifest itself. My core point is we don't want it to become an area of tension. We have enough areas of tension already.
On China, we should mention too that with the economies of many countries being strained, the opportunities for China to perhaps get more involved in infrastructure projects in the NATO area and countries surrounding NATO is perhaps increasing. James Rogers says, given that China's power is rolling across Eurasia through the Belt and Road Initiative, through increasing naval activity in the seas around Europe, and through economic and political penetration in Africa, is it not time for a new NATO strategic concept?
So I'll take that. The two don't necessarily connect together, but I will address first China and then the second. I would say after 2014, first on Russian hybrid activities, unwanted interference in our countries, in other countries around the world, but certainly in allies, had the effect of sensitizing allies to that interference. So the level of awareness that interference in a whole variety of ways, economic or political, cyber, disinformation, that awareness has risen. So allies are more conscious of the need to defend against that, prevent it, not allow it to have bad malign effects. I'd say the same for Chinese strategic investments in allied countries. The awareness of the potential difficulties posed by some of those investments has gone up substantially. I know this is being taken very seriously within the EU, and it's certainly being taken seriously in NATO. So in both cases, perhaps these are cases of overreach by the actors concerned, but allies are thinking harder about what does it mean, and being clearer with themselves that they will look more carefully at investments and in some cases block them. Separate question: should we have a strategic concept? Over time, they've appeared at a particular regularity. At the moment, allies are saying to themselves, we do not need one. We're adapting. The 2010 version is sufficiently fit for purpose, and for now we have other things to think about and real business to do.
There were a couple of questions, by the way, from multiple people regarding the strategic concept, and I realize that may not be completely on topic what we're dealing with. Coming back a little more to where we started with the COVID-19 crisis, Tanya Latici asks, how would you evaluate the cooperation, coordination between the EU and NATO in responding to the COVID-19 crisis in the spirit of the joint declarations, and what could be improved? Have you identified any duplications?
So great question. We have been very closely in touch with EU colleagues during this crisis, very closely indeed. I don't have the sense that we are falling over each other, duplicating. It is possible that we will be able to work yet more closely together. I mentioned that the EU is working on stockpiling. I think allies will also be interested in stockpiling, and I would say that this it is a very good thing that over the last several years we've built up a much stronger and more practical output-focused NATO-EU cooperation, not just a theoretical dialogue, but real cooperation in a number of areas. Resilience is a good area. Hybrid is another good area, and the crisis is really an incentive for organizations which have a lot of the same membership, a lot of the same objectives, a lot of the same philosophy in terms of values, to work more closely together, not to be constrained by old mindsets or old philosophical debates. So I hope very much that in this area of response to COVID, as we go forward, we'll be able to do even more together. But the picture so far, from what I've seen, is very good.
At the risk of going just 1 or 2 minutes over, I promise not to keep it any longer. Just one question. NATO, I know, is set up, at least in its statements, to defend against threats from the east and the south primarily. We don't talk much about the south these days, but of course there's a lot going on there as well. We know that President Macron was intent on bringing more of the Sahel region into focus in terms of possible concerns for real concerns for NATO. We have a question from Salim Ilmaz. He says, NATO values human rights, which gives more value to the Union. Do you think NATO should be giving more attention to what is happening And he mentions Yemen, but well, I would expand that to include the Sahel region and Syria for that matter.
So we already have a significant focus, if you like, outside the NATO area, what you're terming the South. So we think a good deal about Afghanistan. We have 12,000 troops deployed there, and we have a lot of capacity building activities and partnerships in the Middle East and North Africa. We have a mission in Iraq. We work with Jordan, Tunisia, a lot of relationships and a lot of programs. And we have said that we want to look at expanding what we do and developing what we do in this region. NATO will certainly be looking at how it can add value. I know in the Sahel there is openness to more contributions to operations there, so that is a possibility for allies. So that part of our agenda will, if anything, be expanding. And I agree with the premise of the question. This is our neighbourhood. It's also the EU's neighbourhood, and if we can find ways of helping, for example, with relieving migration pressure at source, then that is always, if there is a way of doing it, that is always worth doing. And you know, our operation in Afghanistan, it's not the intent of the operation, but that has probably somewhat relieved migration pressure from that source, from what it would otherwise have been.
Okay, it's time to wrap up. I want to thank everyone for making their contributions, but I'd like to give you an opportunity to say a final word, perhaps in response to the idea. Do you have any final recommendations, takeaways on how NATO can strengthen its resilience or advance its adaptation program into the future?
So I'd say this, my main message is NATO is staying in the middle of this crisis, is staying focused on its main job. So we have absolutely built in the need to help as much as we can in the pandemic crisis, but that does not mean our gaze has moved away from keeping our people safe, defending our area, defending our countries, executing on our operations and activities. Our posture has not significantly been undermined by COVID, and in the big security sense, the world has not suddenly been transformed. So the challenges we faced a few months ago are still the challenges we face now. It would be great if that were not the case, but it is. And I'd say certainly in the coming months and beyond, we will be looking hard at how we can give more emphasis to national and collective resilience. It matters both for health and for security. And insurance for health and security, paying insurance policies will continue to be very important.
Mr. Turner, thank you very much. And I would also like to thank GlobeSec and NATO's Public Diplomacy Division under the NATO Engages banner for organizing this. And thank you to all the participants who joined us and for everyone who sent in questions. I hope we have an opportunity to gather again at some point in the future, perhaps in the same room.
Great. So Terry, thank you to you. It's been a ton of fun. Thanks to everybody asking great questions, and thanks to GlobeSec, and looking forward to the next iteration.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye-bye.
Bye.